On this week's episode of Where We Are, we're talking with John Ward, the author of the new book, Testimony, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. I think you'll enjoy this conversation. You're listening to Where We Are.
Hello, Where We Are listeners. If you're a longtime fan of this podcast or you're just joining us for the first time today, we want to tell you more about our podcast platform called Spotify for Podcasters. We've been using this platform for over a year, and it's been easy to use, and new features are added all the time. You can record and edit podcasts from your phone or computer. You don't need anything fancy, and you don't need previous podcast experience. When you hit publish, you will distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify if that's your kind of thing. And with Spotify for Podcasters, you can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. But here's the thing, you can earn money, but it's a free platform. There's no catch. If you're curious or want to see what it's all about, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
You're listening to Where We Are. We are the Wheres. I'm Michael.
I'm Melissa.
And Melissa, we have a great episode for folks.
We do.
This week, talking with John Ward, and we'll introduce him. Just want to say before we get into the meat of this episode, we're talking just a day after the passing of Tim Keller. And Tim, I'm not going to say too much on this podcast. I may be writing about Tim over the next few days. But I miss him already. Tim was a wonderful man, and someone who became a friend over the past few years. And I'm just so grateful for him, grateful for the life that he led, for all the things he taught me and so many others about Jesus. His book, Meaning of Marriage, Melissa, was like the one pre-engagement book that like we felt like we could trust and that wasn't like weird and
Yes.
and he's just been a force through so much of my life, first from afar, and then I don't want to give the impression that we were, seeing each other every few days, but I'm grateful for the role that he did have in my life. And so, for those of you who are mourning Tim's passing, for whom Tim meant something, we're right there. We're right there with you. I will make a recommendation, and that is that Tim wrote a really wonderful book. I mean, he wrote so many wonderful books, but probably my favorite is a book that he wrote on self-forgetfulness. It's like $4.99 Amazon. It's like 40 pages, I think even less than. It's called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. It's a book that you could get on Kindle or whatever, Sunday morning, if that's when you're listening to the podcast, and you could read it Sunday and knock it out in a day. But I love this little book. It's meant a great deal to me. But more on Tim to come. But did not want to record a podcast without mentioning and honoring him. All right, Melissa, let's get to our conversation with John Ward. So grateful to be able to talk with John. He's in the middle of a book tour. It seems like this book is getting a great deal of attention, as it should. John is a senior political correspondent for Yahoo News. He wrote, this is his second book. He wrote a book, Camelot's End, Kennedy versus Carter and the Fight That Broke the Democratic Party. That book is about the Democratic primary in 1980. He's the host of the Long Game podcast, which I love. His Substack newsletter is called Border Stalkers. John has covered American politics and culture for 2 decades as a city desk reporter in D.C., as a White House correspondent who traveled aboard Air Force One to Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, and as a national affairs correspondent who has traveled the country to write about 2 presidential campaigns and the ideas and people animating our times. He's been published in the Washington Post, the New Republic, Political Magazine, Vanity Fair, the Huffington Post, and the Washington Times. And he is the author, again, of a new book, Testimony: Inside the Evangelical Movement That Failed a Generation. Listen now to our conversation with John Ward. Well, welcome, John. Thank you so much for joining Where We Are.
Yeah, it's great to be with you all. Good friends, and I think I'm a first-time pod guest.
I think so.
You are.
I think so, but it's great to have you on, and really excited to talk about your really wonderful page turner of a book. I burned through it. I know Melissa did too. And could you just start by, this is very different from your first book, which is a more sort of purely journalistic endeavor. This definitely uses your testimony, definitely uses your journalistic skills, but it's also your personal story. Talk about why you wrote this book and why now.
Well, I laugh when you call it a page turner, because it's, just to be clear, it's not a spy novel.
It sometimes feels like it. You get some of these personalities in there, and there's a little bit of criminality implied. Yeah.
I have been called Forrest Gump by some people because I show up in a lot of different situations. But
yeah,
the better reference might be Zelig, the old Woody Allen film.
Yeah, sure.
I think there's a similar dynamic where he shows up in all these different situations. But I have heard from a lot of people that they read it quickly, which is great to hear. Why did I write it now? I mean, I have to say, I always wanted to write about the way I grew up as a college lit major. I just knew there was a lot of good material in my background.
Yeah.
I didn't really know what form it would take for a long time. And I just left it sitting there on the back burner. And I did write my first book with the thought in mind that I wanted to write something about my upbringing, and I had to write something else first. So that was consciously part of my thought process for the first. And then over the last several years, I always kind of really hesitate to tie it to any political figure or Donald Trump in particular, but there is no question that the direction of the Republican Party and the evangelical church and its political engagement over the last several decades has played a big role in kind of bringing me to a place of saying, okay, I think my story has relevance for a bigger audience than just people who are interested in what happened to Sovereign Grace Ministries.
Sure.
Yeah. So this book is like we've just been talking about. It's a memoir of your time growing up in American evangelicalism. And what you do, one of the reasons why I enjoyed it is because I didn't grow up in American evangelicalism. And so all of this history, a lot of it was new to me and was fascinating. You mentioned a lot of big people that I didn't know, but I know that a lot of our audience, when they go and read it, they will know exactly who you're talking about. But so you talk about the many features of American evangelicalism that led to the strong marriage of political identity and the faith. But if you could pick out a defining feature for our audience from your reflections in the book and over the years, what would it be?
A defining feature of my church or of evangelicalism?
Of this the way that the marriage came together between the political identity and American evangelicalism or the faith.
Well, I th- when I talk about the fact that I wrote this book over the last because of the last several years, it tends to obscure the fact that as somebody who graduated high school in 1995,
Mm-hmm.
um, coming of age when the moral majority was kind of transitioning into the religious right, Ralph Reed and
Mm-hmm.
um, Gary Bauer, there was still this moral majority religious right, uh, which really I think it's fair to say dominated a lot of evangelical political engagement.
Yeah.
I think when I say, oh, the last several years were formative, that's true, but it also um, can obscure the fact that, like, I think myself and a lot of people my age, I'm 45 now, from a very young age were turned off by evangelical political
Yeah.
engagement and felt like there was something not um, matching the teachings of the faith and the way we were being taught in church with the way that it was being exercised and applied and lived out in the political arena. And so if I were to point to a point in time when that marriage became entrenched or cemented or solidified, it would probably be the late '70s
Yeah.
when the Southern Baptists had their conservative takeover, and Paul Weyrich and others really worked hard to lock in evangelical voters, with the Republican Party through abortion and through
Mm-hmm.
appeals to racial resentment, some white supremacy. So that was the point in time. But I think an important thing that gets overlooked is the fact that I've never in my life, as a very, devout Christian, I've never been sold on, and in fact, I've been quite turned off by the dominant mode of political engagement in evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just talk a bit more about, like, at the level of the local church, or like just local expression, what that linkage has looked like. So you talk
Mm-hmm.
about your time in going through the Colson, the Worldview program, yeah, but help for members of our audience who are not as familiar. Like, what does it look practically on the ground for there to be this expectation that you're worshiping one day, you're worshiping one way on Sunday, and you're going to vote a certain way on Tuesday?
So much of it is unspoken and assumed and implied.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one thing, going back to what I was saying a minute ago, is just to track my own response to it. Is I write, and I remember, in the mid '90s when I was, I think, in high school or just out of high school, I did some work with my dad, who was a real estate agent, and I remember driving around and him listening to Rush Limbaugh, in the mid
Mm-hmm.
'90s, and at the height of the anti-Clinton stuff. And even then, I was very turned off by the just constant bashing. What I was most turned off by was this sense of a politics that was animated mostly by what we were against and who we hated, rather
Yeah.
than a politics of standing for something and moving towards something. Um, and that has, I think, continued. And when it comes to the daily life of the local church or the culture of the local church, my experience, and I think many others' experience, was a political discipleship through um, largely through omission, because we ignored politics for the most part. We thought it was worldly and
Mm-hmm.
secular and dirty and untoward. And so we neglected an actual engagement and study of and thoughtful critique or analysis of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And And so our political worldview was really shaped through the very singular lens of abortion.
Yeah.
And through that lens, politics becomes very Manichaean,
Mm-hmm.
black and white, either or, and Democrats are cast as not only the villain but as demonic even,
Yeah.
and we see that kind of thinking particularly among charismatic evangelicals now in explicit terms, where they are just day in and day out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Michael Flynn, I wrote about Roger Stone today, reaching out to
Mm-hmm.
uh, the charismatic independent evangelicals. Flynn and Stone are just outright calling. I mean, Flynn called Nancy Pelosi a demon, uh,
Yep.
and Stone is talking about a demonic portal being over the White House. So that kind of simplistic view of
Mm-hmm.
politics has been boiled down to its lowest uh, common denominator, essentially now in that realm of politics.
Yeah. What is universal for like similarly situated folks of sort of seeing this interaction that we just talked about? For you had that, but you also had this really rarefied view of you were reporting on politics, and you had a professional uh, uh, experience of understanding the way Republican politics in particular, but you reported on both Republican and Democratic administrations. What was what was that like for you? I know that your time as a reporter hit in a interesting moment in your faith journey, but what was it? You weren't just reading the newspaper; you were writing the articles that were in the paper, so to speak. What did that? Um, uh, how did that color your point of view?
Well, I mean, the book is part of the book is the story of uh, apprenticeship
Mm-hmm.
Mm,
in the craft and
Yeah.
of journalism, and specifically political journalism. But journalism, apart from politics, really is the beginning of my apprenticeship. And I've begun to tell people, and I'll make the story a little shorter here, but just like when you're starting out as a reporter, one very granular example of how you're trained is, I covered the funerals of U.S. Military service members who were killed in the Iraq War. This was very early in my career. And let's say that you're writing about a soldier who was named Daryl Smith. Um, it's really important that you get his name spelled right.
Yeah.
And you might assume that his name is spelled a certain way, but Daryl and Smith can both be spelled unconventionally. So it's really important that you check
Mm-hmm.
and that you assume that everything that goes into what you write, all of your assumptions could be wrong. So
Mm.
that's sort of the grounding, the foundation for a
mm,
career in journalism. This sense of I need to make sure that I'm getting this right, and my assumptions could be wrong. Uh,
yeah.
and so from there, layered on top of that, I knew so little coming from my very insular church background, and the story of apprenticeship in knowledge of politics and power is one of being on the Hill in 2006 or 2007, not understanding really what a committee is, and then covering the White House for 3 years, traveling the world, and then starting to cover the presidential campaign in 2012 and really digging into how do primaries work? How are delegates accumulated by a candidate or for the nomination of a major party? And so all of that to say, excuse me, that it takes years and years and years of doing this work day in, day out, understanding the process, understanding the players, talking to these people to really begin to accumulate any kind of insight and expertise into how politics and power and government work. And one other metaphor I'll use real quickly is just I think over the last decade, we've seen, Tom Nichols wrote the book, The Death of Expertise. And when you look at the 2016 uh, Republican primary, there were warnings about Trump from every corner of basically everywhere. Anyone who knew anything about politics was sounding the alarm either publicly or privately. And some of those people have now, switched their position often for convenience sake. But the metaphor I would use at the time is you had a lot of people who knew politics who it's like they're in an NFL draft room and they've been watching football since they were kids. They've been playing it. They're experts in how to evaluate players. And so when a play starts to unfold, they can see sort of the different possibilities of that play and where the ball is likely to go and so forth and so on. And basically all the people like that in politics in 2015 were saying this play is going to go a very bad direction. And so, but then you had people who were, had just entered the profession of, being an NFL scout like a year or two ago, who were kind of pulled in by the Trump campaign to vouch for them and say, oh no, this play is going to work out okay.
So getting back to this training that you had early on, and now you've gone and written this book, one of the main questions that I had for you after, because again, I read through it so fast, is how did you balance or sort of get to a point of writing a book in which you're writing about historical elements of a movement, you're writing about your own story, a memoir, and then you're writing about how you covered, once you became a journalist, how you covered all kinds of stories, especially getting into 2016. And, you've got some prescriptions at the end as to how you think Christian engagement should look like in politics. How did you bring all that together, especially with being trained as a journalist to, always be checking things, always having things right, looking at biases and assumptions, things like that?
So is this a writing question or is it how did I weigh how much to include in terms of personal stuff?
I was actually going more towards the writing question of how this got written, but that second point I actually think is just as interesting now that you're bringing it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the writing question was one of having written the first book. That was my first experience at handling a manuscript of this length. It's really hard.
Yeah.
We don't have time to get into all the nuance and detail of that, but when you write a manuscript, a book length, project, it is hard to like keep track of where everything is and
yes,
make sure you're not things and to think about structure.
Yeah.
And I've just been lucky to have my agent is actually really good at helping me with a lot of those decisions. I had a couple people read the manuscript and kind of help me work through that. But I knew that my story was part of it. Obviously, the national political story is part of it. And then I think the one thing that probably emerged kind of like in the first book, Kennedy and Carter and the way their lives alternated and intersected kind of emerged. And I think in this book, what emerged from the writing of it was the way that C.J. Mahaney and Lou Engle both surprisingly came from my home church as a kid and then became representative of these archetypes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was interesting to see emerge in the writing process. And then, in terms of working it out, it's just a matter of revision. By the way, if anybody has never read my favorite book on the on the topic of revision, not just as a mechanism or a tool in writing, but as like a life theme almost, is Kaisi Lehman's memoir called Heavy, which is just an incredible book. And in terms of like weighing how much to include, I would say there were definitely parts that were hard to navigate in terms of how much of this is my story and how much of this is my parents' story.
Yes.
And so there were some things that I kept out because I asked that question and I felt like there were elements that were their story, and that's sort of one of the goalposts that I used for that. And then the first draft, I would say, was angrier, and I worked really hard to rein that in and cut it down. And then I showed the book to my dad and my mom, and we talked through that, and he gave me some feedback, and there were some things that were off that needed to be changed and some things that were not crucial that, he said were embarrassing that I was happy to take out. But I didn't show it to a lot of other people other than that. And Mary Carr's book on memoirs, I think it is, talks about that. So there's also another balance there of like, how many people do you show it to? And
Yeah.
how
Yes.
much do you ask permission and how much do you ask forgiveness?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's so interesting, John. Can you, there's so many different ways. I want to go here. What is your assessment of, like, do individual Christians in churches have what they need to engage in politics in a healthy way, or is it like a losing, is it a losing game? Is the are the structures and the sort of the amount of money involved, is it too overwhelming for uh for for individuals to sort of buffer themselves against some of these impulses that you write about in the book?
Get out of the trenches of tedious tasks like managing order fulfillment and start growing your business with ShipStation. They'll help increase profitability by automating your workflow with their simple, easy-to-use dashboard. With it, you can pretty much do everything you need to quickly and easily. Update order information, print labels, compare rates, optimize shipments, and even set up automatic delivery notifications. And it doesn't matter where you sell. Amazon, Etsy, eBay, Shopify, ShipStation can integrate pretty much anywhere online. Another great thing about ShipStation, they can help reduce costs with industry-leading discounted rates from some of the biggest mail carriers. You might even be able to get up to 89% off USPS and UPS rates. So, make this year your most profitable one yet. Sign up for your free 30-day trial at ShipStation.com and use the code Spotify. That's ShipStation.com with the code Spotify.
Join me, 48 Hours correspondent Erin Moriarty, on my podcast, My Life of Crime, as I take on true crime investigations like no other. This season, I'm looking into the labyrinth of crime and secrets within families. I'm cutting straight to the evidence and talking to the people directly involved, including investigators and the families of victims. Listen to My Life of Crime with Erin Moriarty wherever you get your podcasts.
Is this where the commercial plays for the Center on Christianity and Public Life?
No. That's not what I was thinking of. Though, it is very interesting, John, that came to mind. No. Leave that out of it for now. I'm interested in what you, John Ward, might have to say.
Well, that is why I'm excited that you've started your institution.
Yeah.
I do think it's there's a dearth of resources and institutions out there to help people through this. And I don't know how else we get there other than institution building. And
That's something you care about and have written about quite a bit, the institution building piece.
Yeah. I mean, the complicating thing is that evangelicalism is so anti-institutional.
Yeah.
Right.
At the same time, like, they do build a lot of institutions, but they tend to be parallel institutions that create a parallel world, essentially. And I was just talking to somebody about how what kind of exacerbates that problem is the way we're taught to read the Bible, which I think is really interesting because I think I write about the idea of two books, the sacred text of the scripture and the sacred text of the created world. And that was a really helpful paradigm for me to think about because I think it unlocked something that had been part of my psyche for a very long time. Which is, how do I make sense of a world in which the only revelation is through this text? Rather than thinking about my life as being guided by two texts, which is a way, I think, to be faithful to the Bible while also not denying what is right in front of me. But I think a lot of this anti-institutionalism is exacerbated or augmented by this sense of, well, our only source of information that is authoritative comes from the Bible. And so when something in front of us that we're seeing with our own eyes such as the election was won by Joe Biden. When people are telling us who have authority in the world of biblical literalism that
Mm-hmm.
actually he didn't win, well, then we have to go with them.
Mm.
And it creates this vulnerability to alternative facts. I think the Bible Project is another great institution that is helping us
Yeah.
as a
Yeah.
as a church think about our sacred text in a way that is pushing back against this nihilistic Gnostic view of the created world. And something I said to Jane Coaston at the New York Times the other day, she did an interview, and the last thing I said was, she asked me if I had regrets or if I was sad about anything.
Mm.
And I don't like to say, I don't like to talk about regrets, but I did come
Mm-hmm.
to the place of saying, oh, I am sad that it took me so long to love the world as much as, I didn't say this part, but as much as God does. It says in John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Uh, and I think that so much of evangelical culture fails to teach Christians how to love the world like God loved the world.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. You mentioned your parents before, and how, you're trying to balance, like, how much was this about you and how much was this about your parents. And I immediately noticed when I opened up the book that it was partially dedicated to them. And then it really became apparent as to why you dedicated this book to them, because throughout, especially in the latter half of the book, they're included a lot in, like, sort of like how you were evolving and changing, and what you were thinking was different from how you were raised. And you also talk about your text chains with your family, with your siblings and your parents. And you're very open about it, which is just very vulnerable for you to do, because I think those text chains look a lot like of text chains of a lot of our listeners, and a lot of our audience. The sort of back and forth, the jibes, people holding their views very tightly. And you still, in the end, it seems like you have a great relationship with your parents and you love them. You dedicated this book in part to them. And our audience is asking this question of us a lot: of how do you navigate family dynamics like this, where on politics, with politics driving so many emotions, driving our family dynamics, how do you get along with people who view things very differently than you? And sometimes when they react in certain ways to certain political events, and it ends up hurting you in some kind of way. Do you have advice for our listeners in navigating those kinds of issues?
I've kind of struggled in how to translate my experience into one that would be
Mm.
applicable to others, because not everybody has the ability to publish a book where they kind of put all their
Mm-hmm.
cards on the table. And I recognize
Yeah.
that that's a privilege that I have. But for me, putting my cards on the table was a way for me to let my parents know very clearly, like, this is where I am. Like, this is
Mhm.
where I stand.
Yeah.
And um, I don't, what makes this complicated is that I don't know that they would have heard me
Hmm.
if I hadn't taken this step.
Hmm.
And it was important for me to feel like they understand at least where I'm coming from. Not, I don't care if they agree with me or not. But what was very painful over the last several years was the sense of dismissal. Um,
Mhm.
and not just as a person, but as a journalist. This is like my job to understand and discern and explain
Mhm.
stuff, and it
Yeah.
was being
Mhm.
dismissed as, like, fake news or liberal.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of trying to get underneath that, though, and explain the psychology for me. And maybe that will be helpful to people, but it has been very helpful for me personally to be very clear about where I was, but to do that in a way that was pretty careful and deliberate and thoughtful, and not off the cuff. Like I said, like, I wrote a draft and then I reined it in. Um, and I think for my parents, it seems to have been helpful as well in the context of our relationship, at least. I know it's been hard for my dad,
Yeah.
um, and my mom to some degree. I don't know as much about, where she's coming from on this, but, like, I know it's been hard, but it also has undoubtedly helped our relationship because, and my dad's a really just a special person, high character, um, as is my mom. Um, and he, read it, didn't like it, expressed that. We talked for several hours. Um, but I was coming to the conversation from a place of, I don't need to argue with you. I don't want to argue with you. I've put my cards on the table very clearly. If you have a question about that, I'm happy to like explain it. But I think one of the really hard things about the last several years was like the constant arguing and the need for me to feel like I need to persuade you. And
Wow.
having written this book, I'm just like, I know that I can't persuade people. And if this helps, or changes minds, great. But like, it probably won't. And that's okay. And so I was coming to the conversation with that kind of an attitude, which I think is important. And and then I was able to really kind of get to the core of the issue which was, Dad, I just want you to be my dad. I want you to support my career, take an interest in what I do. And I don't really want to talk about politics with you because it's not really that important to our relationship.
Yeah.
And I know like over the last several years, it felt like it was existential and we really needed to hash it out. But if I had to do it over again, I don't know that I would hash it out as much. I certainly wouldn't hash it out over as much and over like text and social media and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that is my attempt to be.
Yeah, no, it is.
I think it's helpful.
And we've just talked a lot about this over the course of our friendship, John, but what does it look like to you? And obviously you write about this in the book, but what does it look like to you for an evangelical movement to have failed a generation? That's the subtitle of your book. But for there to still be so much good that was transmitted through, that was in some ways, not every way that we would like, but in some ways the foundation of that movement. What does it look like to carry what we want to carry with us forward, even as we reckon, as you do in this book, with the ways in which the evangelical movement failed?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've been asking myself this even recently, like which generation was failed? Was it just
right?
Or was it theirs too? I think it was theirs.
Yes, that's it.
But I was just sort of noodling on Substack about, if we leave our faith behind, like, is political identity the only thing that's left? And that's not really a new thought, but but it came from this idea that, or this observation that I've had, that I've been puzzled when I see people who take their faith assumptions down to the foundation, or even decide they can't really believe it anymore, but they leave all their political assumptions intact. Like that, really puzzling to me. Like, how can you do work on one but not on the other? And I think part of the reason for that might be that if you're leaving behind your faith identity, you need something to hold on to.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you just leave your political identity where it is. And but I think we've seen quite clearly that, like, if politics is all that there is, then it becomes infused with the type of intensity that you often see in religion. And of course, we had religious wars, a couple hundred years ago, which is why Rausch's book on the Constitution of Knowledge is so important.
Yeah.
But if politics is our religion, then we lose the key characteristics that I think Christianity gives us, the key, like, character qualities and sort of mystical power to be able to forgive your enemy, and to be motivated by more than self-interest, to be interested in helping the weak and working towards the common good. I did have a conversation with a lapsed Muslim friend of mine who said, like, if you don't believe in an afterlife, that actually motivates you to live as happily as possible now, here and now. And like part of that, like your self-interest would motivate you to make the world a better place. And I think that's true to some degree, actually. Like I think it can be true. But self-interest alone, I don't think is enough, oftentimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the Christian faith really pushes us out of that. What I try to do in the book is just say, look, I've come to a place in my faith where I can't tell you for sure that what I believe is true. And that's the point of faith. Like you need faith to believe it if you can't prove it. And so I'm still practicing Christianity and I believe in it, but I'm holding it with a different grasp than I was taught to.
Yeah.
What I do know for sure is like we have to find a way to love one another. You know, all of the basics of Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, and that's what I think is really crucial for our country and for the world. And I think evangelicals, like their focus on heart religion, is actually quite moving and powerful and needed in public life.
Yeah. We're gonna move on from your book kind of for one question, and then we'll just have one more question after this one. But Donald Trump is running in 2024. New York Times just reported Senator Tim Scott, who I think will be a favorite among a certain set of evangelical elites and sort of intellectual evangelicals. New York Times just reported that he is likely to announce as early as Monday next week with 22 million cash on hand, so he'll be taken seriously. As you see the Republican field shape up, just give us your sort of assessment of what you're expecting over the next year.
Yeah, Tim Scott, I think, kind of fills that. He's most like Rubio in 2016.
Yes, exactly right.
Young, non-white, optimistic, very kind of evangelical, but without all the white Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that you've got so many people still either in the race or ramping up to get into the race tells you something, which is that all the people inside the Beltway and on cable TV and at cocktail parties who are saying, oh, Donald Trump's the nominee, guaranteed, like those people don't think so. Now, the rebuttal to that is Tim Scott's just running to be vice president. And that could be true. I don't know. I think that's an open question. And I do think it's a legitimate question as to whether or not he would move to contrast with somebody like Trump. We've seen DeSantis do the contrast, the back and forth. I have no doubt that Nikki Haley could do it if she felt like it was to her interests. Mike Pence already done it. Everybody counts Mike Pence out. I'm not quite ready to do that.
Okay.
And so I think the big question for Tim Scott, who has the most upside of any potential, Republican candidate by far, I think, like if he were to be the nominee, I don't know, that could be a slam dunk for the Republican Party in 24. But getting to the nomination is the hard part.
Yeah.
And, I think there will probably come a point when he's forced to choose between, do I sort of play it safe here and keep my options open, or do I really go for the brass ring, which is probably going to mean some kind of open confrontation or contrast to some degree with Donald Trump. So, I don't know what the odds are for Trump right now. He's still the favorite, but I think there's still a lot of time left. There's a lot of developments to come out. I talked to Scott Reed, who's working for Pence's super PAC, and he made a good point. He's like, this is always a good way to think about any kind of election. He said, if the primary was held today, Trump would be in a great place, but it's not going to be held today. and there's a lot of time left, and there's a lot of storm clouds on the horizon, which I think is basically right.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Yeah,
Melissa,
very interesting.
I know that you have a question to end with.
Yes. We've covered the book. We've covered 2024. The thing that I want to know, because it's in your book, and I was kind of like, okay, you're not going to spend time actually giving us the details here, but I and our listeners would definitely want to know, what is it like to fly an Air Force One? You flew multiple times. Were the seats comfy? Were the snacks good? That kind of stuff.
It's pretty cool. Yeah, I got to say. I need to post that photo on Instagram. I'm doing like a chronological
Yeah.
bio. The food's actually pretty good. The seats are comfortable. My favorite AF1 story, I never got called forward, but my favorite AF1 story is actually that I watched I Am Legend on a flight one time. Will Smith, like I had finished, usually I was working, but I had finished whatever I needed to do. And there was nothing going on, and it was probably a long flight. So I just like pulled out my laptop and started watching this film. And I think it was my first time watching it because it got so suspenseful that I turned off the volume, and then it got more and more suspenseful to the point where I actually like was on Air Force One and I'm watching this movie. And I just like shut the computer.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be a story if it weren't for the fact that I'm watching this Air Force One, which is kind of weird.
Yeah.
I really love that.
That's good.
Okay.
That's good. Now, see, I would have watched the Harrison Ford movie.
Oh yeah, Air Force One. The title of the movie is Air Force One. Yeah. That would have been a little bit too on the nose.
Hey, John, really good to have you with us. Again, we're big fans of your book, big fans of you personally. Thanks for talking with us about it. Testimony inside the evangelical movement that failed a generation. It's getting great buzz. Folks love it and would encourage listeners to check it out for themselves. John is chief political correspondent for Yahoo News and just a wonderful guy all around. John, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. That was fun. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, again, would encourage folks to get John's book, Testimony. And Melissa, always love talking with John. He's such a wonderful guy, brings so much wisdom and experience to so many conversations, especially on the kinds of things we talk about on this podcast.
Yeah, that's right. So we thought that you'd really enjoy a conversation with him. And one of the things that I was thinking as we were getting ready to record the episode is that I feel like we're creating a genre of episodes, for me at least, where I'm meeting your friends for the first time by recording a podcast episode with them. You've known John for years now, and I still have never actually, sat down with him, met him, kind of thing. And we've now done this a few times with guests. No, it's like, hey, nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, no, it was kind of funny. He came on and he was like, oh, I didn't know I was getting both of you. No, it was, that is true. Now I'm going to have to think about that. Who do I want Melissa to meet through the pod?
Yes, when we had Christine Emba on a few months ago, that was my first time having a conversation with her, despite being an admirer from afar.
Well, something to look for in future episodes, but that's all we have for this episode. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with you next week. Until then, this has been Where We Are.
Bye.